Professor Mervyn King chaired the famed King Commission on Corporate Governance as part of Nelson Mandela's international plan to retain confidence in South African industries and institutions as the apartheid regime fell and democracy came to his country. The thought leadership that came out of the 4 King Commission reports has dramatically changed governance across the world. This is the first of a special set of 3 interviews between Professor Mervyn King and GGI's Chief Executive, Professor Andrew Corbett-Nolan, on good governance and how the King Commission is important to the British public sector of today.
So, the beginning for you, where was the beginning for you, Mervyn?
Well, my parents came from a humble background. My father worked in a grocery store and then in a liquor store. Eventually he got his own liquor business. But then the apartheid laws came into play when I was a toddler. And my father was not allowed to sell liquor to non-Europeans, as they were called. And of course that absolutely destroyed his business, and he was not prepared to live in South Africa. And he immigrated to then Rhodesia, now Zimbabwe. So I went to school in Zimbabwe, which had certificate, Cambridge A certificate as the qualification. So university, I went to university, Wits University, and I had to work as a waiter. Various things I did to help pay fees and survive while I was a student. And then I qualified in law, cum laude with honours, and I didn't know anybody, so I thought I'd better practice as a solicitor because we have the same 2-bar system as you have in the UK. And I practiced as a solicitor for 3 years to get to know the solicitors, for them to get to know me. And then I went to the bar as a barrister, and I had a very successful career as a barrister. I became a silk QC after only 9 years at the bar. Usually it takes longer. And I had a huge commercial corporate practice. And then I went on the bench, and I was only on the bench for about, including, we have an acting term and then a full term in South Africa for about 2 years or 2.5 years. Then I resigned as a matter of conscience. When I resigned, many of my clients asked me to come on their boards as a non-executive director, and so started my business career. By 1992, I'd had 12 years in the business world after my practice at the bar. And we were going into our democracy. And the Institute of Directors of South Africa, affiliated to the IOD in Pall Mall in London, together with the Johannesburg Stock Exchange, the South African Institute of Chartered Accountants, asked me, because of that background, that I had a academic knowledge of corporate law and accounting principles, and I had done it. I'd been a director, I was a director. At that time I was chairman of 2 very large companies. And they asked me, would I consider forming a committee and writing guidelines for the majority of my fellow citizens who had not been in the mainstream of the economy because of the apartheid laws, as to how to direct and how to manage. I said I would consider this. And then I got a call from Mr. Mandela. Now, I knew Mr. Mandela before he went into jail. And while he was in jail, I chaired an organization called Operation Hunger with his 2 daughters. We fed about 2 million children every day for many years while he was in jail. And the real hardship of apartheid was really in the rural areas more than the urban areas. It was the urban areas that, I beg your pardon, the journalists came to from overseas. So he and I used to talk to each other when he came out of jail and he became president of the country later, but this was 1992 before he became president, and he phoned me to discuss something with me. And he showed his prescience because he spoke about what was happening to our education system, which really has decreased in value for the children in our country for various reasons. But he foresaw it already in 1992 that it was going awry. So he wanted to discuss that with me. And then I mentioned to him I had been approached to do this. And he said to me, "You're the right man, do it. But just make sure nobody charges money. They put their hands on their hearts. And they do it in the best interest of South Africa, Inc." And that was one of my criteria for inviting people onto the committee which I formed, which then assumed my name, the King Committee. And the first committee was very representative of what became known as our Rainbow Nation. It had on, for example, a young man called Ibrahim Patel, who was then with the South African Textile Workers Union, and now is a minister in our cabinet. I knew that the paradigm in which companies operated then was the primacy of the shareholder. That the belief was the director should act in the best interest of the shareholder. And the belief was that increased wealth at the top, and it would trickle down to the bottom, to the impoverished at the bottom. It was known as the financial capital model. The truth is that throughout the 20th century, that was the basis of governance, that boards acted in the best interest of the shareholder and increased the wealth of the shareholder rather than focusing on the long-term health of the company. And consequently, we had, during the 20th century, a century of unsustainable development. And I was aware of all this in 1992. And so I wittingly steered my committee away from coming up with a primacy of the shareholder model, following what was happening in the rest of the world. Because in any event, if you think about it, moving to 94, our democratic election, it would have, in Bell Pottinger's language of today, been seen as white monopolistic capital and would have been rejected. And so I realized I had to come up with a new model. And by 1994, we issued the report, and it was based on a board should learn and understand what are the needs, interests, and expectations of its various stakeholder groupings pertinent to the business of the company, and then make a decision in the long-term best interest of the company. And that model was a new approach to the governance of companies. You will remember by 1990, Cadbury had issued the Cadbury report, which his remit was focus on the financial aspects of governance. The model of governance, corporate governance in South Africa under the national government, was the primacy of the shareholder, exactly as was happening in the UK was happening in South Africa. And as I said, I knew about this because as a corporate lawyer, understanding corporate law and accounting principles, I realized that to come up with such a model with the majority of our people not having been in the mainstream of the economy would have been completely unacceptable. And so I came up with this model, which I've described to you, which has really taken the world by storm, as you know, Andrew. And the National Party at the time, it was interesting when I came up with this model, they were not delighted with this model, I would say. But very interesting. only recently, one of our cabinet ministers said to me, the King report has become one of our main exports. And that is correct. As you know, it's been followed around the world as a blueprint in several countries.
If we now focus on the road between Kings 1 and 4 and broadening out yet further the responsibilities and the mission of governance, and taking us to the place where you were able to crystallize the meaningful outcomes of governance. That would be an interesting road to explore, I think, in this next bit.
All right. So that was 1994 was the report, which became known as the King Report, and assumed my name as chair. After that, I was invited by Kofi Annan, who was the Secretary General, to chair the United Nations. They called it the Eminent Persons Group at the United Nations, to look at the governance and oversight of the agencies at the United Nations out of the oil from food scandal. You will remember that. And Kofi Annan and the leaders in the UN were concerned that the governance structure of these agencies, WHO, very in the news these days, United Nations Environmental Program, United Nations Community on Trade and Development, all these agencies. And I had 27 people on that committee, leaders, eminent people from around the world. Dean Professor at the London Business School, for example, was one of them. And we restructured the governance and oversight provisions of the United Nations. The relevance of my telling you that is not self-praise. It's because I started really learning about sustainability, working with United Nations Environmental Program, for example. And I started learning of what I knew about, but then I started understanding the tragedy of ecological overshoot, which is the technical term for that by the end of the 20th century, companies in the main, individuals to a lesser extent, had used and were using natural assets faster than nature was regenerating them. Clearly not a sustainable matter. In consequence, I asked my committee that we needed to write another report to recommend sustainability reporting. At the same time, I was asked to become the chairman of the Global Reporting Initiative in Amsterdam, and it became the gold standard for sustainability reporting. So the second report was issued in 2002, where it was recommended that companies in South Africa should do sustainability reporting following the G2 guidelines of the GRI, the Global Reporting Initiative, which are now standards. And it became a listing requirement on the Johannesburg Stock Exchange. So it was the first stock exchange in the world to make sustainability reporting a listing requirement. What had happened was that suddenly there was a realization that the Milton Friedman doctrine of the sole purpose of the corporation is to make profit without deception. Not even if it was being subsidized by society and the environment, Professor Friedman. Well, the answer was companies' profits were being subsidized by society and the environment. Many companies were making their bottom line, but adversely impacting on the environment, for example. And so we had a planet where we were subsidizing bottom line profits by society actually losing value and the environment being adversely impacted. This came to a head, I think, by 2007, certainly 2008 with the GFC. And it was the International Federation of Accountants that called for a meeting at the United Nations headquarters in Geneva, where I was asked to speak. And at that meeting, which was held on Chatham House rules, now public knowledge, the president and chief executive of IFAC were present. I was there. The World Bank was there. The International Institute of Internal Auditors was there. IOSCO was there. So international institutions were present. And it was one of those dramatic historic moments where IFAC said, well, we have to now accept that financial reporting is critical, but is no longer sufficient for a board to discharge its duty of accountability. Because firstly, we have to acknowledge that it's historic information, and it's coming out in a form now so complicated that it's almost incomprehensible to the average user. But it's also only reporting on 20% of market cap. Sustainability reporting is becoming more important because it's reporting on the so-called non-financial assets. I was always opposed to that term because if you think about it, how a company is making its product or rendering its service, and that is having an adverse impact on the environment, for example, it's having an adverse economic outcome eventually. So they're actually all financial. And this led me at the meeting to say, well, you say sustainability reporting is more important, but sustainability reporting on its own without the numbers is actually quite meaningless. We need the numbers, but we also need the company to show how they're dealing with these sustainability issues, which become critical in a world where natural assets are being used faster than nature's regenerating them.